of all, thank you so much, Donnie and Anna, for being here today. Really do appreciate it. Looking forward to this discussion. Maybe let's start off with just short introductions of kind of what you're doing, and kind of tell us more about your company and such, and what you do there.
Let me go first.
Go ahead.
All right. So yeah, I'm the CISO at Figment. We are a blockchain staking provider. So what that basically means is we provide infrastructure and validators so that our customers can easily stake their tokens and earn rewards.
I'm Donnie Hasseltine. I am the CISO at Xenon Partners, which is a B2B SaaS PE firm, buy and sell B2B companies. I am also running one of their portfolio companies, Packagecloud, which does a hosted repository management kind of artifactory. And before I got into tech, I was in the Marine Corps for 22 years, bounced around the world. So,
cool, awesome. Well, both of you are in very exciting domains. Obviously, blockchain, crypto is all the rage, and then software supply chain is a big deal nowadays. What are some of the biggest worries that keep you up at night?
Well, a couple. I think just being a CISO, we have a lot of worries, right? You have to kind of look at security and layers, and are we preventing attacks or blocking right in the right areas? At Figment, there's a couple of things, right, that our world is a little bit different in the crypto space, where slashing events are a really big deal, and secrets management or keys to any of our secret keys, we can't have those get out. So those are kind of the main focus, which is a little bit different. I come from other industries like the financial industry, cloud industry, tech. It's just a very kind of different space. But the other thing around that is probably just making sure that I'm partnering with the right teams. That's the only way really that I think security can be successful in any organization. So that's what doesn't keep me up, but that's what I think about a lot.
yeah, I think that's a great question. The thing for us, just looking at it from a broader standpoint, right, is what don't you know that's out there, right? And I think, not to paraphrase the former SecDef who said, like, talked about known knowns and known unknowns. I mean, it's the unknown unknowns that terrify you as a CISO, right? I know there's things I don't know, but if I can narrow that down, I can put a box around it, it helps. It's the other things out there that are concerning. And with Xenon, because we have a lot of different companies, each one has different technologies, different architectures, different kind of data they handle, and different customers. So being able to understand how those interrelate is really critical, because if you're not careful, and I guess the other way I would say is when you look at broader trends of cybersecurity, right? For a couple of years, ransomware was all the rage, still a big threat, but it's gone down with the enforcement on the Conti and our evil groups. So now you see web applications being targeted on the rise. And a lot of times it's not that they're going after your web application, but they're going through you to get your customers. So I guess that's the thing that kind of concerns me sometimes, is not someone who's coming directly at me, but coming through me to get to somebody else.
Cool, awesome. Well, flipping the question, last question a bit, what measures and tools do you put in place to actually help you sleep at night?
I'm always going to go first.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So visibility, kind of back to the unknown. So any kind of visibility tools that we, visibility, next-gen anti-malware, we always, the perimeter type tools, all of that. And then, of course, since where are we at Teleport, any advanced access type tools.
No, I'll second the access stuff. I mean, that's really critical, especially when you have a lot of different architectures and you have a remote workforce. It's how are you managing that access and that security? Because you got people working from home. Do I own their network that they're on? No, I don't. What are some things I can make sure that that access is granted just in time? It's ephemeral in nature. The SSH is protected. Those sort of things out there. But I think beyond that too, a lot of times I think we go toward the technical tools, but it's also important to realize, like, how are we building the team, right? And it's sometimes with smaller companies, it's just who is going to be put in charge. They may not be a CISO, you may not have a security team. Who's the person in charge, and how can we communicate with them to start setting the parameters of the right culture, so people are seeing things and reporting things and saying this doesn't look right, which gives you a real advantage as a CISO to be able to respond before you find out. Because usually when you find out, it's already gotten pretty bad,
So jumping right on that topic as well about building that team, how do you go about building like that kind of security culture within your company?
Well, I've been lucky enough when I came to Figment that we were like right at that growth period. So one of the goals, just to when I joined Figment was to create that culture and build the team. I've done that a couple times in other organizations, which again, like that's a huge advantage that I can come in and do that, versus trying to fix maybe a security culture that has already gone bad. Like that does make it a little bit more difficult. But it's really about bringing other teams in. We've created champion programs where there's other representatives from teams to kind of make it so that they're also part of the solution. You know, nobody likes to hear this whole old traditional Department of No, because security really does need to enable the business, but at the same time, there still needs to be a balance. So I'm not big into like, you know, just people like throwing complaints at security, but really saying, okay, how do you think we should do this? And then kind of work together. And then, of course, just the overall program of security, I think, builds the culture. So looking at from a risk-based approach and just being able to explain the why.
You know, I think there are two great points there is you know, you can't, if you're in security, you can't be a Department of No. There's just no way, because people will go around you. And there's shadow IT problems or things that come with this. You've got to be a trusted part of the team. And a way to look at that is don't just look at building culture within your own security team, and you may have a good security team build that culture. It's got to go across all the business units. And sometimes that's finding allies in those individual units and making them effectively your security rep, but making everyone feel a part, that they are all part of the security team. I mean, everyone, you know, in the military used to say, like, everybody is collecting, everybody is a part of the team. So wrap all that in, include not just your own internal security team, make sure everybody feels a part of that, and open up those doors of communication. I think too often we will sit, not just in security, we'll sit in our own little perspective and not get out and engage with those other teams, but understand, you know, why is that developer going around this security control every time? Once you understand why they're doing that, what their concerns are, you can usually find a way to solve that problem for them, and then you become an ally for them, and the whole group is more secure.
Actually, I'm going to dig into a question I was going to ask later, but I think this is perfect timing for that. Is like nowadays you see kind of two different types of CISOs. You kind of see the CISOs that are more about like they want to check a box, they want to protect the perimeter, lock things down, you know, say no to everything type stuff. And then you have the others that are more hands-on, technical, get into the weeds on things, you know, actually trying to see how they can enable the business. And you know, back to in the keynote was talking about like making security like the easy button, making it, you know, the security of yes type stuff. So how do you see the CISO role changing over time? And like, you know, from the days bygone of like, oh, the you know, CISO says no to everything, to actually a CISO helping actually enable the business?
I think it's about being flexible, and you have to continue to learn the technology and your craft, the space that you're in. Because if not, then all you'll be doing is managing, I'm going to just call it traditional security, and you'll never be able to get past that hump. And you want to continue to bring in really talented people that know more technology and more space. I mean, when I think you probably agree, when you're at the CISO level, like, you don't get to get as much hands-on as you normally would, because you're in strategy, or you're doing vision, or, you know, there's all this other like overhead stuff, that business stuff that you have to get involved in. But I think that you have to set aside that time to add more certifications and just to be really knowledgeable and keep up with new technology.
Yeah, I think we're well past that two-dimensional CISO and kind of a walled garden island sort of perspective. It's not just three-dimensional, it's four-dimensional. And I think what Anna said is really spot on, in the sense that, you know, a lot of times when you think about a CISO, you have this vision of this very super technical leader, and that is absolutely a part of it, right? You have to stay fresh, you have to be tracking new trends, but CISOs really are more at this point involved in the existential risk that surrounds the business. It can't be just like an IT function. It's got to be much, much broader. So one of the critical skills, I would say, beyond the technical aspects is, are you a good communicator and a strategic communicator, not just to your own executives and your own board, but externally? Can you talk to customers? Can you talk to vendors? I mean, a large part of what I do at the CISO at Xenon is not just trying to protect the architecture, but a lot of times getting on the phone with one of our Portco's customers who has a security issue. And, you know, you go through this really crazy vendor process we could have another whole conversation on, right? But a lot of times, like, look, just let me get on the phone with the CISO. Like, what are your concerns? Let's talk about the data. Let me explain how we're architected. let's get past, do you have a SOC 2 cert? Let's talk about how it actually works and how we're going to work together well.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, I mean, vendors in general can be a challenge to deal with. You know, how do you kind of go about, as you go through looking at new suppliers and new vendors and everything else, how do you go about determining what that risk is to you? And like, again, talking about the olden days of like, okay, had they checked the box type stuff? Like nowadays, again, talking about software supply chain, you actually have to really care about your vendors and what are you getting from your vendors, what data they have, and everything else. How do you go about kind of dealing with the problems that come with that?
Actually, right now, we are completely revamping our security review vendor due diligence process. Just because, well, you know, we're maturing. I guess we'll just put it that way. However, we do have a pretty robust risk management program that aligns with vendor reviews. Like you said, check the box isn't necessarily, that's not the direction because, sorry, anybody can get a SOC 2, like, and just
Absolutely.
like scope it. I don't see the point, even though we all go through the song and dance, right? But it's really about what data, right, do they have, what's the integration. So Figment is a fully remote company. It's not like we have, you know, like all in-house applications. I mean, we do for our services, but not like back office, you know, systems. We have a lot of vendors. So just making sure that our vendors are not, you know, an entry point into our environment is probably the most important. So it just really depends on the data type, the threat, the functionality, and then making sure that we can apply our tools, have the visibility, make sure that our tools, like our security tools, can integrate as it relates to logging and SSO and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think the first point, which you mentioned, is the right step, is what data are they going to hold? And then second of all, how are they going to connect and integrate with us, both from pulling and exchanging information and from our monitoring tools from the security standpoint. Beyond that, I think one of the key things is especially from the CISO perspective, is social proof, right? It's very hard sometimes just to take the sales perspectives just right on pace. I want to see what's behind that. I want to see how it functions. I want to test it if I can. And I want to ask other CISOs, usually in the security space, like who else has used these tools? What competitor tools have you used? And really try to understand how does the product work, how does it touch, and how is it going to impact our customers if something goes really horribly wrong once we use it.
So you mentioned, you know, everybody can get a SOC 2 report nowadays and everything else. Are there still compliance frameworks that are worth doing? That like, or is it just, you know, do you see benefit to doing a SOC 2? Is it actually going to help the security of your company, or is it just checking that box? Are there other ones that are actually useful here?
Yeah. How do I put this? I think that one, from a sales perspective and business perspective, it's almost expected. Like if you don't have it, then you really have something wrong. Or if I go to a vendor, I'm like, you didn't even go through that? Yeah, I don't know that I even want to use you. But at the same time, I know that it's not like the most perfect framework. Me personally, I've always had a love for PCI, but that only applies like, you know, for the use case of having credit card data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some benefits going through. Like, you know, we a lot of times have early stage companies or companies that really revert to early stage or they come in at Xenon. So sometimes turning those controls is really critical because you realize, like, wait a second, we do have something that's sitting in AWS that's not encrypted at rest when you turn that on. So there is an aspect of like, I don't want to completely, although there's a part of me that hates checklists, I don't want to completely put it aside, right? Because it's helpful because it reminds you of things. Like when SOC 2 has 200 and some odd controls. If you force yourself to go through that list, it reminds you of things to check. So I think the danger, though, is it's probably most useful the first time you do SOC 2 as a company because you see things you didn't realize were there or you forgot about. But after that, especially if you have continuous compliance monitoring platforms, it can very quickly get to the point where you don't look at it anymore. And that's where really the risk comes in. We also, I mean, within our companies, we also use Cloud Security Alliance's Consensus Assessments Initiative Questionnaire. I think they call it CAKE sometimes. Some people say CIQ or CAKE. But we like that because it's a good checklist. And the other thing is for an early stage company that may not have the money or the time to go through SOC 2 right off the bat, you can self-certify. You can demonstrate that you're putting some effort into security. And that also helps you from a perspective of purchasing you. Like, okay, I can see now that you're taking the right steps to go in the right direction. And that helps us figure out and ask really the more specific questions, okay? I've looked at your checklist. That helps me now identify these are the 5 things I really need to talk more about vice the telephone book,
Cool. In a modern company nowadays, developers are always kind of chasing the new shiny thing, the new tool that they want to use, the new framework and everything else. How do you go about determining the risk to your company for these new frameworks, tools, whatever that your developers want to use?
So we've integrated like a SDLC, software development lifecycle, and various tools like Guardian, I think Sonar Cloud. Does that sound right? Yeah, a couple others. But it's about really making sure that security is kind of lock and step with the developers up at the very beginning all the way through. We also have an in-house red team that partners with the developers quite a bit, which always makes me feel great because then it's like right after they're done, then the red team goes in and does their attack to see if there's anything that we need to address immediately.
Yeah, I think the key thing is, do you have an SDLC process? And you can use a lot of different tools, but the key thing is to look across the entire supply chain, right? From source to build to deployment integrity, because across that entire chain, you're going to have gaps. And you can look at all of them. There's supply chain attacks that have hit every single aspect of that chain. So do you have a process that's going to look across the broader perspective of it? And then are you working with developers at each stage of it? Because I think that's the key thing. If you're waiting to do any type of waterfall, either intentional or otherwise, where they deliver it and hand it out, and then you have to go back to the drawing board, that's super painful for you. It's super painful for the developers as well. So if you can catch something early on and say, hey, can we just re-architect how we looked at this problem? Again, it's not no, it's just how might we get to this stage? That's really important. And it's just having that collaborative relationship across the supply chain, which I think is really critical if you're going to be successful.
I mean, it's just the notion of shifting left, basically, right, of this. And so, this is a very common thing nowadays of like trying to bring resources closer to your developers to allow them to do that testing side of things during the SDLC process, and the QA part, and the security testing much earlier in the process. What are you doing? So you mentioned Guardian, Sonar Cloud, there's a few other things. Yeah, if for companies that have not yet started making that shift, are there any kind of particular tools, even open source projects, whatever that you would recommend that people look at to like help them get the developers to that shift left mentality?
I think it's hard because I've seen such a wide variety, and I think it really depends a little bit on the individual companies, right, on what they use. But I mean, certainly make sure that you have a clear source control, you have a CI/CD provider that you're doing, and you've linked that up properly. I mean, I think that's the key connection across that line. But I'm trying to think of some other tools that I would throw out there. But I mean, there's just so many that are out there. It's really hard to narrow down to one or two. I'd say in that sense, sometimes it's like find the one, tell the developer like you need to do X. Find something that works for you, and then kind of have that conversation from there. And I think that one of the things we've seen at Packagecloud specifically is when we're holding the packages at the very far end of the deployment integrity, what are the things we can do as we accept that to look back across and communicate? And even things like, can we come up with a way so that when developers are adding those dependencies and pulling them, and they're in flow and they're in the command line, they're just pulling stuff out, there are things we can just flag in their workflow to say, maybe you should look at this one last time before you move to the next step, or here's where you can get some additional information on that. It's really critical, though, that whatever you integrate isn't disruptive, where they have to stop, go someplace else. So that's kind of where security needs to meet. Like, what does your workflow look like? Okay, how do I integrate, communicate, engage, and collaborate in that workflow?
Cool. So we talked a bit about kind of tools, process, and everything else, and like things you put in place at your organization. How do you measure the effectiveness of these kind of security measures, security controls that you have in place?
So I have a subset of KPIs, right? Whether it's incidents, vulnerabilities, we track all of that, and then we use what's called OKRs, so objectives and key results mainly. And it's not just about measurement of like an actual count, because we measure risks as well, high, medium, critical, low, but really it's the security posture. So some of it might be more qualitative and based on observation. So I do it, it's a blend, basically, to kind of say, where do we sit? How are we improving? And then, of course, phishing test results. Like, we're still doing that. It's kind of killing me a little bit, but yeah, it's still happening.
Yeah, I think you have to design the KPIs that meet your product and work well with your team. I think that the other thing, there's two pieces that kind of I think about sometimes, and that is you can't plug every risk. And I think sometimes they think as CISOs, your job is to find risks and make them not risks anymore. You're going to have to accept some. So again, it goes back to the point, do you at least know what they are? So you can communicate to your team and say, this is a problem, likelihood's low, but if we're going to fix it, this is what we need to do. If we're not going to fix it, here's the potential things that can come downstream from that. But I think the other thing, and this ties also maybe back to the security culture when you mentioned the phishing tests, like, yeah, like, to be honest, you can read all about these crazy technical APTs out there, but usually someone clicks something in an email. Like, that's quite frankly the way the credential theft happened, right? And you have to test, you have to educate your team, but the other thing I would say is, like, a lot of security teams I've seen go down this like crazy name and shame process, and sometimes it's because the CISO's seen somebody fail at this so many times they want to scream. But I think when you do that, though, you create an unintended negative culture, right? So we've gone our way to, when we do have somebody trigger that, is to make it a training opportunity, make it an education piece, and not to embarrass them. I mean, like, I'll share one crazy thing that happened along that line, which we had a new teammate come aboard. They just joined the broader team, and their security training, like, it was like a Friday. The security training was going to kick off on Monday, and on Saturday they got a text from the CEO saying, "Can you go do gift cards?" Right? And this is just, I know that's crazy. That's a scam we've all heard of, but this individual had not heard of it before. When I did it, we're like, you know what? Got it. 24 hours later, you would have seen this exact example in our training. You would have done this. We'll cover down. We'll eat the cost. We'll take care of it. It was an honest mistake, but, like, let's get better. So it's always about, like, stop, take a breath. How do we get better?
All of us know that hiring good security professionals is really hard, and that, you know, even today, like, we have this whole new set of aspiring security professionals that are trying to get there to get into the field. Is there any guidance that you would give somebody that's very early in the career, or maybe is still in school or something, or maybe it's like an engineer that wants to get into the security space? What advice, what guidance would you give them?
So I'm always looking for unicorns, obviously. But normally, I look for other talent. So, like, they come from a networking background or a database background, or they're a developer, and I'll notice that they'll start getting more focused on security or partnering with the security team more. And I'm like, you know something? I think you should go and get your security certification, or you should go down this path, because the mindset is so important, where security does need to be first. Mm-hmm. So my point is like, it needs to be more than just security, and you have to know the technical aspects. So I started not in security, it was in networking, but I think it helped me, because then I started understanding, like, where the threats are and how to plug them and have that conversation. And back to what you were saying, like, around being able to communicate is so important in security, because you won't be effective if you don't know how to communicate.
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight the cross-functional nature, because if you always are looking at problems the same way and your team is looking at it, comes from the same background, you're going to miss things. Diversity of thought and diversity of experience is really critical. So one thing certainly is, if you see a teammate of any aspect of the business who is showing interest in security, you should cultivate that, right? I think if I was giving specific advice, I'd say, like, go out and get Security Plus, get a basic certification so you understand the vocabulary, because once you understand the vocabulary and you communicate it, you're going to learn more things. And the other thing is find a mentor, either within the organization or without. Go to a security conference, meet someone, and try to have those conversations to get advice on how to move forward. I think as long as you're understanding the fact is, you certainly have to have technical competence, you have to have certain skills, but don't push someone off because they don't have what you think is the right perspective. I think in security, we almost all have a degree of imposter syndrome, where we come in and, like, look around the room, and because it's just so broad, like, you can't be an expert in anything, in everything. So it's what do you bring to the table, and how do you accentuate your strengths, and how do you bring in other teammates and friends and mentors and peers to help cover down where your weaknesses are.
Makes total sense. Cool. So one last question, kind of to close things out before we open up the floor for Q&A and such. But what is one piece of advice that you would give security teams to stop doing?
work that's not valuable and doesn't move the needle. Sometimes I notice we can spin, right? Like maybe we need to back away every once in a while, just and we'll go down like this rabbit hole, and you're like, why did we do that? Or we're trying to check boxes. Like, where's the real value for the business? And I think that is one thing probably is like, the CISO has to know, it has to be very aligned with the business because the security team needs to support the business. So the security team should be working, right, to reduce risk and support the business. And if we're over here doing something else that's not valuable, I think we're wasting time.
Yeah, I think don't try to do it all yourself. And I think sometimes that happens a lot where we think that's my responsibility to do it. Like, no, kind of like what I said, reach out to your network, reach out to other people. If you hit an obstacle, actually try to find someone else. 'Cause I think so many times we will get wrapped around a problem or an issue and we'll just continue just to drill at it from the same angle. And it's really important to step back, break out, and then ask for help and bring in it. Maybe your team, maybe another team, maybe people outside your organization, but that's really critical is when you get stuck, realize you're stuck, ask for help, bring other people in.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. I would love to open up the floor for people that may have some questions. First of all, let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions. Oh, question over here.
Thanks. So security requirements often like increase the costs of projects, whether like indirectly, like it's extra engineer time that a team needs to devote to something, or directly like the SSO tax, like security insists we must pay for this. Like, how do you convince your partners that it's worth this cost, which can often like, you know, I hear complaints from many apps teams. They're like, this will delay our launch. Like, how do you make security worth it for them? That it's worth their time. It's worth their team's budget to do this.
I'll start out with that. I would say that's probably one of the hardest questions in security is demonstrating the ROI, right? I mean, and it really depends on just how good you are, again, as a communicator. I think it's important to understand, a lot of times with engineers, developers, you can kind of walk through like, here's why this is important, and if you go down this road, here's what could happen, and this is why it's going to be a really bad day for you if it happens, because you're going to be back to ground zero. And so you're going to be doing stuff you don't want to do. So let's talk about what proactive things we can step up early on. But I think it's also really important, like I said, when you're administering those tools, even more so than the cost, is to understand like how do they integrate with the developer workflow so you're not interrupting it, right? Because you don't want to, if you make something totally secure, it's totally unusable too, right? So how do you find that blend? And I would say if you keep your developers and engineers happy, you stand a better chance of arguing for that ROI on the backside. But it's tough because when you say, I need this amount of money for this, and you get it, and the next year, like, did it work? Like, did someone attack us? Did we do, like, we don't know. It's a real challenge in security.
Yeah, and there's other things at play, which is like where does security report to in the org structure? How much budget, right, is applied for security? It's like all about timing as well, because sometimes in some organizations there is no budget for security, and then like operations or the developers, they have to assume that cost, or product didn't consider security as part of the delivery, and then the numbers are all off for profitability. So that's why it's so important that security has to be in those conversations up front. But yeah, it's more, hey, this could happen, and let's take the most riskiest, I can't speak, obviously, say that word, vulnerability and tackle it from there.
I think adding on to what Travis was mentioning is that, like, specifically the SSO tax, that a lot of times somebody will request a new SaaS tool or something, and they only need like the lowest tier, something like that. But these companies have SSO in their like super most advanced tier that is cost 10, 20 times X. How do you deal with that? Like, what is the answer if you have one?
Our answer is it's required, period. If you want it, you have to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, you can look for alternative options or other things, but I mean, at the end of the day, when you set there's certain security things you're just not going to compromise on as a CISO. Like, you just can't, because it opens too many other doors, right? That individual product may be fine, but again, if you're leaving a door open or a window open, you are allowing someone to get through your product to other customers and other issues, and that's really where the concern comes in. So you certainly have to have certain points where you just say, nope, we're going to do it this way.
And the management of it. Like there's more management if you don't go that route. And it's not like we have people just sitting around not doing anything, and then if there is an incident, then there's more time and more management and more people, and then we got to stop working on the other things that are important to go and fix this fire because we didn't pay for the right license.
Kind of touching, like I know Travis mentioned budget, but I'm thinking more along the lines of how do we facilitate a good, like a healthy view of security amongst more human-focused teams like HR, sales, finance, stuff that teams that aren't necessarily going to talk to security outside of like the occasional training.
That's a good question. So, and that is it's a different audience, right? Some of the things that we do is we actually we'll join a team meeting and take maybe 10 minutes of their time, right, to talk about, okay, in your situation like finance, these are the kind of emails that you're going to get. These are the kind of threats. This is how it impacts, right, the organization. And it's really just about communication and making them a part of security as well, just like the technical teams, even though we talked a lot about developers, but it's the same applies for the business.
Yeah, I would just say when you think of the big, broad perspective of cybersecurity, just remember that humans make computers and humans use computers. It's usually not the computer's fault, to be completely honest, right? So if you understand that and you approach it from a human perspective and engage with those teams, really important. But you're right, you also don't want to take your HR team and then bombard them with some type of technical security concepts. Like at that point, like Anna said, these are the types of threats you're going to see on a day-to-day basis. So can you tailor the training so it's not like a burdensome thing, but you're arming them to be better prepared to not get in trouble or not have these issues occur to them.
Anyone else? Question? Oh, over here.
Hi. I have actually two questions. One is, as a CISO, what are the key metrics you are constantly watching and trying to improve? Second will be around the dependency management. There are so many open source projects and libraries and teams are using left and right, and how, as a security team, you are making sure you are bringing right tool or right library and so forth. Example like Log4Shell and so forth, how we can stop these kind of things happening. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can take the dependency management because that focuses a lot of what we do at Packagecloud. I think one of the pieces of that is just understanding where those dependencies are and understanding how your developers are selecting them and integrating them. Right now, we've helped work with Open Source Software Foundation and Google. They have a program called SALSA right now, SLSA, which you can look at slsa.dev, which is helping to try to identify software provenance across that line and also highlight those dependencies. So trying to find ways that you can ensure that you're thinking a little closer about that. And then also when you get the final product, just some very basic things like, okay, if you're going to use this dependency, are we locking it to a certain version? Are we pinning it inside the build so it's not calling out? What are the things you can do to basically limit that exposure? And then making sure, when you talk about metrics, if we know our software and our SBOM has these certain dependencies, are we flagging that so when a vulnerability pops, we're identifying it, we know where we need to focus the team on to do a patch or adjust from there. You talked about metrics before. I don't know if you...
What was the second question?
The second question was...
My metrics are actually within a Jira dashboard and connected through various other tools. So I look at those metrics daily. Just back to risks, vulnerabilities, potential incidents, events, phishing, you name it. So I look at that on a daily basis. The amount of tickets that come in on the development side, just kind of where we are on the red team testing, and the changes that are coming through because we have a pretty solid change management procedure as well.
Yeah, can I have one follow-up question on that? Sorry.
You get 2 max.
Yeah.
Joking.
Because that's the saying, if you have also many tickets, it may seem bad. And if you have also less tickets, how you find the right balance, making sure we are doing enough good job to be secure that we have less tickets and so forth.
So is the question kind of more how do I balance the metrics and what does good look like? Is that?
Yeah, if you have many reported maybe the security team is doing a good job finding all this stuff. From the second side, maybe team is not doing a good job that you have so many.
Right, it's like around remediation, things like that. Yep.
Yeah.
So yes, I do think, in personal opinion, my security team's awesome at finding things. And yeah, sometimes remediation doesn't get done as quickly as possible, but it requires dependencies of other teams, right? So just making sure that we're part of that project set aside, like figure out what the risk is, and have that conversation so we can be like, hey, this needs to get fixed immediately, it's a critical. Or we have 60 days, it's maybe a low or medium. But I mean, those are sometimes difficult conversations because I'm oftentimes stopping progress, back to what you're talking about, of something else that's going on that's just as important. And then we're competing priorities. Very common. Any company I've been at.
Yeah. I would just add, when you talk about metrics, just make sure you're very clear in understanding which of those metrics are measures of performance and which are measures of effectiveness. Because oftentimes you can build KPIs that will just keep going like, yep, check, check, check. But like, it's just saying that something happened. It doesn't say whether it's good, bad. And it ties back to some of the earlier questions, like where do you think your risks are? Because there have been times we've set up metrics and looked at them, and then after a month or so, like why do we even have that on the dashboard? To your point, like number of tickets doesn't necessarily mean it could be really bad or it could be really good. So making sure you're looking beyond that and understanding, from a phishing standpoint, like a great measure of effectiveness is I have teammates call me up like, this doesn't look right. Did someone send this? Like that to me is a great measure that, okay, our training's working, things are moving forward, but it's really hard to build a metric, how many people identified a phishing email. So just make sure it's clear about, are you measuring numbers? Because there are reasons to do that, or you're measuring how well you did at something, which is usually the more meaningful metric.
I got a call recently and this person said, hey, I just failed your phishing test. Does that mean we can still be friends? They're like, I'm so embarrassed. You're going to see my name on the sheet. So, yes.
That's a good security culture, though.
Right.
That's a good security culture.
Thank you. They want to be my friend still. That's good.
I think it's also important to talk about how you convey risk to the business, and especially to the engineers, where okay, say a vulnerability comes in and CVSS score says oh, it's a higher critical and everything else, but you'll find that over time, because of how the CVSS scores don't take your environment into account,
Absolutely.
is that if you don't do a better job of explaining to the engineers that hey, this is how it could affect us type stuff, then they just stop listening to you, and they're less likely to jump on things when things happen. Do you have any advice on how to deal with that?
Yeah, I think recasting is really important, and being able to have that conversation for sure. If not, you're spot on. But then you have to also sometimes remind that recast based on facts, I guess, is maybe the right way to put it, because it's not I don't have time, so I should be able to recast and score. It's more no, we need to use the facts of the real security threat.
Yep. No, I completely agree, and I think CVS is a good example. I mean, it's a great methodology, right? But I don't know how many times either we've received a bug bounty that comes in, or we've identified another one. It's it's a 9.7. I'm not in our environment, isn't right? The calculator's for free. Pull it up online, redo it, and explain people what it means, right? And there's plenty of times when AWS Inspector will key off, and you'll look at it oh, it's 2 critical vulnerabilities, and you look at that yep, that's a critical vulnerability. But they would literally have to have control of the network, the Wi-Fi, and the person's actual computer. So that's a lot lower in the risk than even a moderate, say, vulnerability that anybody can access and do.
I mean, I think that the recent OpenSSL vulnerability is a perfect example of this, that originally came in and got scored, CVSS score basically of critical, that's what they thought, and then it's ones that got announced and they lowered it down based off oh, this actually isn't going to affect a lot of people. You have to do this specific thing that a lot of people aren't doing too. So, I mean, it's very environment specific. And I don't know that there's, either you have to take the time to test each vulnerability, which is almost impossible you don't have the staff to do that, or you have to okay, this is what we have and kind of go with it kind of thing.
You made another good point that I think is really critical being a CISO is don't be alarmist. Right? Be a realist, but don't be alarmist, because the SSL is a perfect example where even some very reputable CISOs came out and said this is going to be a disaster, and then it wasn't. So are you Because if you're the person who's crying wolf every day, you're going to wear out your teams. So it's really critical you only step in. So when they call you, you have the relationship with, you know what, this doesn't happen very often. We are going to stop. We're going to focus on this because we know it's important. And that's probably more when you're a CISO of a specific company and you own it. That's a different ball game than it's sometimes in my role in a PE firm where I'm finding something and going into another team who has their own general manager, own director of operations, and trying to convince someone why that's important.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think we're just about out of time here. But one more question over here.
These columns are not ideal.
So I'll have to speak around the column. One of the problems that I've seen with a lot of engineering teams working with InfoSec is that they're often like very separate. Like you have like here's where you put the scanner in, or here's where you do the code review. Have you ever seen any companies or organizations that perhaps there's an engineering architect who is reports up to the CISO, but perhaps is embedded with the teams in order to help them get some of those more difficult things right and make sure the architecture is done in a safe and secure way, rather than leaving it to people who are not security experts but still doing their best? Like, have you seen that pattern ever used before, or seen any success with that?
So over the last couple companies I've been at, having a security architect that's familiar with the cloud is really important to me but normally I'm coming in either developing a framework or working with teams to build out like a new architecture design that meets specific security requirements. So it's just maybe a little bit different, where that is a requirement of mine to have a security architect. The most important piece, though, at Figment, one of the things that we've recently done is recently architected a new staking Gen 2 environment. And what's important about that is that it brought in various teams, or like various architects from different teams, to come in, and we developed a framework together, right? Because in blockchain, there's not like this standard on this is what you must do, because it is just a little bit different. But I think it created that bond between the teams where they came in and they built this environment together with the standards where we could still be efficient and secure. So.
Yeah, no, I think the first step is, can you just make sure that you have security involved in those conversations? I've seen it happen maybe to what you're specifically saying, organically a little more the way Anna described it earlier, where we had a CTO in our company who got interested in security, and next thing you know, he and I started talking. He went out and got CISSP, he got his certifications, and so now he is much more attuned to integrating security in the whole process, right? And that's great because it's not me going and telling you you have to do it. It's I understand it and I'm going to integrate it as well. So I think nurturing the people that find that interesting and helping them along the way to be more effective in their jobs, and I think that's a great way to spin it, is we're making the developer more effective by being more secure. But I think also if you have a full and mature organization, just making sure it's part of the process where we have to have a security architect in the room who's going to contribute and actually be a part of the team, and ideally that stays with that team, right, while that product is being developed, instead of just showing up at the initial meeting and then coming back at the end to check some boxes.
Cool, thank you all. I just want to give another round of applause to our two panelists today. Thank you, Donnie. Thank you, Anna. Appreciate it.